Okay, excellent. Welcome everyone to this IAQM webinar, Integrating Air Pollution, Greenhouse Gas and Other Wider Impact Analysis into Decision Maker Support Tools. I'm delighted today to be joined by Justin Goodwin, Director at Aether. Justin has 25 years of hands-on experience of air pollution and climate change analysis, reporting and policy advice. Thanks very much for joining, Justin. After Justin's presentation, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions. So please do submit these in the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen at any point during the presentation, and I will then read these out on your behalf later on. This webinar has been recorded and will be made available on the IES website and YouTube channel, as well as the IAQM website. If you are watching the recording on YouTube later on, please do subscribe to our channel. And thank you so much for joining today. Great to see so many of you here. And Justin, I'll now hand over to you. Thank you.
Hi there. Hi, everybody, and thank you very much. This is a great opportunity to talk to a huge list of very respectful people. I'm speaking really about some background work that I've been doing for many years, looking at integrated air pollutant and greenhouse gas emission inventories. So that's my starting point. But finding, as the years go by, more and more relevance of doing that work for a whole host of different reasons. So I'm happy to be sharing some of that information and knowledge with you. Part of it's revolved around a report that we're writing for the Initiative for Climate Action Transparency. So this is an initiative driven by the UN and the Paris Agreement, and also for other organizations focusing on clean air and air pollution. And this guidance is going to be coming out for review in March time, and we're looking for opportunities to get feedback from anyone and everyone about how this guidance can be used to improve the integration of an understanding of air pollutant greenhouse gas emission inventories and data. So the guidance is really driven, I suppose, by the climate change agenda, but the climate change agenda is very much focusing on sustainable development as well. And you'll see themes in the Paris Agreement about sustainable development, about understanding wider impacts of climate action. And one of those strongly linked impacts, usually positive, but often having some conflicts, is air pollution. And so this is the driving force for this guidance. I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of the approaches and a bit more on how organizations can develop these centers of excellence that we feel are needed as we start to explore and ask questions more and more of standard policy making on climate change and air pollution. This is a little bit about me. I'm sure you'll be able to see more information. I'm a director at Aether, which is a small environmental consultancy focused almost entirely on trying to understand ways of gathering information, using that information and helping policymakers, decision makers to make the right decisions around that information on principally air pollution, greenhouse gases, now going into climate change, overall looking at adaptation, climate finance, things like that. I've been involved in a number of different guidance documents, the UNFCCC review process. That journey has taken me in contact with a wide number of different organizations, different people, different countries. And I still feel like I'm learning a lot from interacting with different groups on how to establish strong and useful teams of expertise to do this type of analysis and feed it into decision-making processes. So although a lot of my background is from international work with developing countries, with the EU, I'm finding a lot of relevance for domestic activities, work with local authorities, work with businesses, organizations to do the same type of analysis. This is interactive, so I'm sharing in the chat a link to the mentee voting. This is Mentimeter. You can use the QR code. You can go to www.mentee.com and enter this code here. And this will allow you to see a slightly amended view of my presentation, but also interact with some of the sliders and some of the information that I'm presenting. So I'll see at the bottom, and you'll see at the bottom of the screen, the number of people that are interacting with this, with the system and with the questions. And it's a useful way for me to gauge some of the interest and backgrounds to people in the audience. So please follow the link. Please feel free to give me feedback as I go through my presentation. Some of the slides will be static that I'll be presenting, but some of them will ask some rudimentary questions about the topic that I'm talking. So you can join as we go along. I hope you have a chance to give me some feedback. And the first bit of feedback really is to gauge who you are, who's here listening to this presentation. I also wanted to present this because it gives a bit of an overview of the different types of people or backgrounds that are starting to need to engage in this area of tracking air pollutant greenhouse gas emissions. And we've got the public civil servants that are now increasingly expected to have insights into strategies, policies, action plans, and not to make mistakes on key decisions, on policy decisions. So we've got, you know, the public servant there that is doing his day job or her day job, but also needing to take into account a vast array of new information all the time. We've got the pressure groups, NGO charities, who need to be well informed on the pros and cons of different actions for air pollution, climate change, even societal gains or losses. The academics looking to push the boundaries of science to help us understand things better. Consultants that are looking to use that information to provide valuable advice to their clients. We've got business and industry now increasingly interested in this flow of information, needing to apply it to their own operations to understand where their impacts are and how to improve them. And then, you know, a range of other interested parties. The next question is what activities you engage with. So when we look at air pollution, climate change, we've got a range of different disciplines, going from air pollution monitoring. We even have climate monitoring, actually, which I haven't put here, but monitoring what's happening, concentrations in the air. We've got air pollution regulation. So this is trying to make sure that vehicles or industry or even domestic premises don't emit too much. It's smoke controls or traffic controls. And we've got the policy making. So this is looking at strategies, trying to understand what objectives need to be set and how to set reasonable targets for achieving them. Climate policy as well. So quite often now we have air and climate policy people working together or being the same person. And of course, energy policy comes very strongly into it when we're looking at burning less polluting fuels or using new technologies. More and more, we see spatial planning and design as a key point of leverage for making decisions about how cities are designed, how we build roads, where we put things. So these disciplines are becoming more and more important in the work that we need to do to reduce air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. I think everybody understands transport planning as well. And then there's a host of other activities where we see the need to start to understand this flow of information. So why are we doing this? I thought I'd look at it from a UK perspective. I mean, we have obviously heard a lot about the Paris Agreement. We hear a lot about the Sustainable Development Goals and trying to make sure that we build our economies in an environmentally friendly way, not just for ourselves, but for others. But I'm focusing here on the UK just because it provides a very good tangible example of why this integration is important. And I think the UK is a situation we can be proud of because we have been pushing the boundaries of environmental discipline, looking at climate change. So the first is the Environment Act, which is a newly revised set of targets and goals, came out last year. And the parts that I've highlighted really are where I can see the touch points to needing this information about air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions estimates or emissions and removals estimates. So when we're improving air quality, we need to understand what we're tackling, what the main sources are, whether they're going to change based on policy. We're particularly looking at human health, ambient PM 2.5. Again, we can measure the concentrations, but when we realize they're too high, we need to understand where it's coming from. And then some more intangibles like halting the decline of nature. So this is something that we can help monitor through some of the work we're doing on inventories, and particularly the greenhouse gas inventories, where we're doing some quite detailed analysis of forest and land use and land cover. And this brings us information and interested parties to analyze nature, forest, reforestation, deforestation, use of peat lands, etc. And increasingly looking at wetlands as well. And then the environment improvement plans, we need to work on ways to work out the most important actions and what they're going to deliver us. So inventories come into that. And this cycle of environmental monitoring and development of indicators. We're going to have people scrutinizing whether these actions are working, where we're going, what challenges are we facing. So we've got quite a few key touch points with even the high level elements of the UK Environment Act. The themes in the Environment Act include waste, recycling, clean air and nature. I've highlighted clean air and nature, and I've just pulled out a few bullet points from the sort of the summary of these, highlighting the call to action really for a number of different areas into which this flow of data on air pollutants and greenhouse gases can go. So local authorities, being required more and more to take responsibility on air quality. Smoke controls, key area of interest. And then we've got the biodiversity targets, and also the interest in UK businesses, not just having an impact within the UK boundaries, but wider scale impacts, and particularly deforestation and the new agreements that are coming out of Paris, a much wider scale, more issues to deal with in terms of our consumption in the UK. So then we've got the Climate Change Act, and I'm sure everybody knows the Climate Change Act very well. Now sort of morphing into terms like net zero. So in 2019, we set the target for net zero by 2050. And this has wide-reaching implications and needs for us to monitor greenhouse gas emissions, reducing emissions from power, from imported fossil fuels or from any fossil fuels, and essentially reducing emissions to net zero by 2050, with all the implications that that has, including implications for society and for jobs and changes in jobs. So we've got the Climate Change Act that's driving the need for information from a climate perspective, a greenhouse gas perspective. So these two aspects then give us quite a strong driver for having an integrated understanding of where our trends in emissions and removals are going. And we've got really the Climate Change Act on one side and the Environment Act on the other side, both demanding the implementation of action, tracking of action, the illustration of success, highlighting of challenges to come. And really that comes from the perspective of the activities that go on in the UK and looking at how those activities are impacting on emissions into the environment of air pollutants or greenhouse gases. So we've got quite a strong mandate to look at this in more detail. And we need to look at it from a perspective of human health, well-being, protecting our own natural environment, and also protecting the natural environment of others. And so this is not just the global impact from greenhouse gases, but also the transboundary impact of air pollutants that will form new pollutants in the atmosphere and cause problems outside our national boundaries. So I'm going to go into a little bit detail now. So the background to some of this is this report on integrating short-lived climate pollutants and air pollution into climate change monitoring and transparency frameworks. So this is driven by the climate agenda, but also a collaboration between the Climate Clean Air Coalition to try to understand ways to help policymakers, help analysts understand the impact of activities on atmospheric concentrations of air pollutants and greenhouse gases. This is typically what we call inventories, but the inventories are things looking in the past. So those inventories are also used for projections to look into the future and look at future scenarios. And they also inform policy decision making if you do them correctly. So this is joint work from the CCAC and ICAT, looking really from a national and international perspective. But there are things we can learn at a subnational perspective, and really starting to look at practical approaches. So this is a technical document. It's going to be used by practitioners, and it's going to help to start to set a framework for doing this combined analysis. And ultimately, this will help us evaluate and track progress with air pollution, greenhouse gases. This helps with understanding of health benefits, as well as the NDC, which is the nationally determined contribution implementation, which is countries' commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So the report itself is going to have 5 chapters. The first chapter is really why are we doing it. Second chapter makes strong links to the Paris Agreement. So that's part of our mandate, is to help bring the Paris Agreement into this kind of analysis, and frame it under the development of analysis for helping with sustainable development goals. Chapter 3 provides this technical guidance. So it's starting to unpick for each sector where we can transition to improve the inventories from a greenhouse gas inventory perspective to get the data we need for air pollution analysis, health analysis, modeling. Chapter 4 really looks in detail at how health analysis demand for data, and how the inventory work can support that, and what other models, complex and simplified models, are used to come up with health impact analysis. And then chapter 5 is looking at how teams might be able to start setting themselves up to do this information on an ongoing basis. And this really draws on a lot of the work under the Paris Agreement, under the Kyoto Agreement, which is to help countries establish teams of people and data flows to do this kind of analysis on a regular basis. Typically, there are no organizations involved in tracking air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions using that data for projections. And we're developing effectively the management processes and practices to get that set up in place in countries using existing organizations, and bringing new skills and tools into those organizations. So I'm going to go through very quickly a little bit more detail on each of the chapters. So the first is about why we integrate air pollution and climate change, obviously improving decision making. Linking air quality and climate change gives us a better view of the pros of taking action. It engages us with more stakeholders. And it means, hopefully, that we can increase in ambition for both, because we're having multiple benefits. There will be some conflicts that we need to be aware of, but we can hopefully keep those at bay with better understanding and knowledge of what's going on. So what are the pollutants? There's another question for you in the mentee survey. I'm interested to know how much people on this call get involved with these different pollutants. Based on your background, you could be very heavily involved in all or some of them. And what we're covering in the document, in the guidance, is really focusing on this blend of air pollutants and greenhouse gases. The air pollutants are prioritized because they also form climate gases. So we're focusing on particulate matter, nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide, ammonia, volatile organic compounds, principally because some or all of these form black carbon and tropospheric ozone. which are short-lived climate pollutants, along with methane and hydrofluorocarbons. So they will have an impact on the radiative forcing of the atmosphere. So we're interested in them directly from a Paris Agreement perspective for that, but we're also interested in them because we can help to emphasize the co-benefits of reducing these gases for human health and for other environmental impacts. Obviously we can see, and you'll be able to see these slides afterwards with this feedback, you can see there's a lot of focus on nitrogen oxides and fine particles, which are primary pollutants for human health, but we can also see that there's some interest and involvement in the other gases, including greenhouse gases. The chapter 2 is really looking at leveraging the Paris Agreement for enhanced transparency. And what we're trying to do is to get the Paris Agreement as a vehicle for change. And I think some people will agree that when we look at climate and we look at greenhouse gases, it's a very dumbed down perception of global problems, but it's a useful metric to get people on board and to get people to understand the problems. And hopefully there's a lot of synergies between taking action on climate change with solving some of the other environmental problems. So from our perspective, we want to make the Paris Agreement a positive force to improve health and well-being of people locally and globally. So that's a very strong driving force. If we can make sure that we understand the conflicts, then we can go a long way to helping other issue areas. We want to develop these action plans that are integrated with air and climate, because a lot of the sources of the emissions and pollutions are the same. So if we do that, we can minimize the conflicts. And we want to make sure that we don't just work in these silos, because actually what we're trying to do is we're trying to integrate systems thinking and good decision making into the existing decision making processes that are there in local or national government. So we're really focusing on policy advice, tracking progress, whatever can go into strategy reports and action plans to make them more transparent, more understandable, more compelling, and actually working on improving sustainable development through the SDGs by looking at a couple of the key ones on climate and human health, but also addressing some of the other SDGs through this combined analysis. Main interests, integrating analysis. So this is the chapter 3 on the sectors, and this is the very detailed chapter that will go into how the different sectors and the sectoral analysis needs to be fine-tuned in order to get useful information out of this work. So I'm interested in hearing from you which sectors you're interested in, which sectors you're working in to try and solve policy problems. And in this chapter 3, we look at the standard sector analysis, energy and industry. So trying to figure out ways of analyzing and managing data that deal with this conflict of biomass as a solution, biomass as a problem. We're focusing also very much on how do we collect data from industry and the industry's impacts, and a lot of this regulatory reporting that's coming through, and how do we maximize that and make it efficient. And also, how do we get better and more detailed data in order to inform policy making? Because traditional inventories are more of a reporting tick box exercise. We need to get beneath the surface. We need to understand what types of technologies and what types of activities emissions are coming from, and where the policy levers can influence reduction. So that particularly for industry and energy, we're looking at those aspects. And then for transport, again, the conflicts of biomass, wider analysis on the impact of new technologies. So then we start looking at electric vehicles. Are they good or are they not? Potentially even questions about scope 3 emissions, which we won't cover, but we'll highlight that there's an important aspect there. And also the question of multimodal shifts and looking at active travel. How do we give ourselves a base level of data that helps policy analysts work on solving some of these problems? With agriculture, we've got the nitrogen flow, which is critical for a range of air pollutant greenhouse gases. We're also looking at how we estimate particulate matter from agriculture. And for air pollutants, where the inventories internationally are not as evolved, there's an increasing need to account for biomass burning, which isn't accounted for under the greenhouse gas inventories. Not so much of interest for reporting on land use change in forestry for air pollution, but there's a wealth of information in greenhouse gas inventories that may be able to help with some of the broader elements of analysis for air pollution and environment analysis. Waste, we've got landfill, fires, incineration, open burning, which is much more important for air pollutants and greenhouse gases. And then we've got this cross-cutting need to improve the data that's traditionally been compiled on greenhouse gases to improve it for air pollutants, looking at spatial detail, temporal detail, and a lot of other information needed to get to the health benefit modeling. This is a table which breaks down the analysis and the guidance that we're providing. So looking for each of the sectors and subsectors, the type of things to have in mind with data collection, data analysis. And then in chapter 4, we're looking at integrating air pollutant and greenhouse gas emissions to support health analysis. And there's a range of additional factors and features that need to be incorporated, including, as I mentioned, spatial emissions, temporal profiles, weather characteristics, chemical reactions, and then the spatial receptor data that's needed in order to understand whether emissions convert into pollution that's having a bad impact. So we need to understand these in order to understand air pollutant and greenhouse gas policies. We then look at also the systems and developing systems for air pollutant and greenhouse gas emissions, and how we can start to build teams, how we can start to build the capacity for data collection on a regular basis, build the credibility of the data that's being produced, get that data in front of policymakers at the right time, and build a better understanding of how the activities, the policies, measures, the strategies that we have at the moment will influence emissions of air pollutant and greenhouse gases in the future. So what I'm trying and what we're going to be trying to do with this guidance is to understand where countries are with developing their pools of expertise and where they need capacity building, where international investment can help with building those teams of decision makers, of experts. And I know there are a lot of consultants on the call here today. And I think that there's a great opportunity for consultants to get more involved in building these sustainable, coherent teams of people in decision-making organizations, in local government, in national governments, in countries across the world. And so these components really are 4 main components of the development of systems to integrate this data. We need some kind of focal point, somebody who's in charge of the data gathering, managing technical input, developing the teams, producing the reports, got that oversight of where the data is coming from and who's looking after it. Then we need expertise. So we need these sectoral experts. They could be coming from policymaking backgrounds or from the sectors, the operating sectors themselves. We need regular engagement with stakeholders so that they can provide the data or that they use the outputs of the system, make it valuable, keep it going. And of course, we need to actually understand what outputs we're contributing to, what reports, what indicators, what government briefings this system that's preparing this information is producing. So, that's most of my presentation. I've got a rather ragbag set of questions about future interests. These are the kind of things that came up while I was reviewing some of the material from the questionnaire. I'm very interested to hear what the audience feels should be the next set of activities in trying to build this integrated approach to understanding air pollutant greenhouse gas emissions inventories, where we're focusing on working with developing countries. We're focusing very much on, at the moment, under the Paris Agreement, just building teams that could do the basic greenhouse gas inventory reporting. And what I see and what I expect many people here see is that when you're doing that, there's so much opportunity to build a little bit more capacity and awareness to do so much more with that activity data, with that understanding of transport, of energy consumption, of behavior that's coming in, and not just produce a static report that goes to the UN and isn't really used. So building these joint air pollutant greenhouse gas analysis teams can really inform day-to-day decision making, engage with stakeholders. And then linking air and climate mitigation adaptation action is another important aspect that I've seen internationally, because a lot of the time when you look at action, or we look at change and things we're trying to do for our own social, economic development, they have a multitude of different impacts on air pollution, on climate change, and even on how resilient we are to the outside environment. And adaptation is a key aspect of looking at what climate change is bringing to us and how we have to build resilience to it. So all of this linking is becoming more and more important, and it seems like a good time to start to build that into the development of the systems that we're going to need for decision making. Taking that another step, we look at wider impacts analysis. You look at a list of actions. If those are climate actions or air pollution actions, you can probably go through those with a set of stakeholders and start to tease out what wider impacts they have and spot conflicts that they may have. And that's a useful exercise that we do quite regularly with developing countries when we're helping them with their climate action plans. Energy is a key influencer of emissions, including transport. And that is quite complex modeling. So there's a lot of interest now in understanding energy models and what those models tell us in terms of air pollutant and greenhouse gas emissions. We've got a lot of models out there that do that in various different ways. There was some interest in understanding the mitigation solutions and matching those up to air pollution solutions. And we've got some new things coming in, like low carbon capture and storage, hydrogen. It's probably new for air pollutant analysts, trying to see whether they're positive or negative. Climate finance, so that's a route to investment in action. How can we piggyback on that, or how can climate actions piggyback on health investment? Looking at the synergies between those. And then private sector engagement, and this is massive under the Paris Agreement, under a lot of initiatives, is trying to figure out how to get the main actors, the main polluters, the main driving forces, the main consumers involved in building policy that is sustainable and has a positive impact on the environment. I think I'm going to stop there. I think I've gone slightly over my half an hour, so we can go back and open up for questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Justin. It was really interesting to hear about this guidance and also the importance of integrating greenhouse gas and air pollution emission analysis. So I'm just going to jump straight into the Q&A section now. So if anyone does have any questions for Justin, please do put them in the Q&A function. So firstly, in terms of the table that you had up about the different kinds of the sectors and the different emissions, we've got a participant asking if you'd be thinking about emissions from fertilizers and tilling from agriculture, and in terms of waste, whether you're thinking about the effect of exported materials to other countries.
Yes, so agriculture is actually rising up the agenda, and there's quite a lot of analysis that needs to happen, because methane is a key greenhouse gas. And there is this line of thinking now that the way we're accounting for methane, the global warming potential that we're using for methane, isn't a just potential. So there's a lot of interest in the agriculture sector. We know it's a critical sector for society, it's food production. We have to be delicate with how we deal with the agriculture sector. And so these aspects are certainly included, especially when we're looking at the sort of non-methane producing elements for PM10 from tilling and things like that. Very uncertain estimates, but certainly ones to be included in the analysis.
Amazing.
Sorry, what was your other question?
So the other one was talking about waste and about exporting materials to other countries.
Yeah. So traditionally, these national inventories set the boundary at activities that happen within the territory. So there's a lot of discussion about exported emissions or exported problems. And those tend to be addressed a little bit in the sidelines by looking at some of these consumption or production-based estimates. The numbers that nations are measured on are much more focused on the territorial emissions. So these things get lost, even to the extent where we export a lot of our manufacturing. So our emissions go down, but we still use those products. And a lot of that, there's a lot of science going on to try to address that and raise the profile of that. UK government is doing quite a lot to look at that, but it's not a formal accounting approach.
Great, thank you. And what is your opinion on the role of the planning application process with regards to climate change?
Yeah, I've always been intrigued by the planning application process, and I always felt like it could have a much bigger role. I think that in order to do that, though, there needs to be much better evidence base available for the planners to work from. And I know that there's a lot of other things that are considered in the planning application process, but I hope that we can see much more integration of knowledge and understanding on climate change and air pollution in the planning application process in the future.
Great. And how do we factor in that industry has changed significantly over the last 2 decades, and a very significant proportion is not covered by environmental legislation, but is still releasing pollution into the environment? There is little or no data on this, and therefore you could say that we're not looking at the bigger picture.
Yeah. So I suppose there's two components. One is the component of the industry that we don't track because we just buy the products from elsewhere. Now, global agreements hopefully should address that. That assumes that my second point is that industry releases are tracked and understood, and that there aren't, even in this country, releases of pollution that aren't accounted for. And I think in order to account to figure that out, we need to do more on our remote monitoring, use of satellite data, use of measurement technique, inverse modeling, to try and track back where we see traces of pollution, then we can't account for where that's coming from. So I think we need global agreements to make sure that we attempt to regulate and capture information on emissions into the environment everywhere. And then we need systems, surveillance systems, to make sure that we're not missing anything because we haven't created the right reporting systems, or because there's some kind of illegal activity that's managing to go on below the radar.
That makes a lot of sense, and something that was discussed quite a lot at COP26 itself, I think. So what do you think is a key driver to engage the private sector to integrate air pollution into the current greenhouse gas emissions reporting?
So one aspect is those large emitters, or I wouldn't necessarily even call them large emitters. I'd say the regulated emitters, the permitted emitters, to try and engage them in a simple process for reporting, a process where we can understand and analyze their impacts, sort of almost a non-punitive process, so that we understand what's going on in the atmosphere aside from the regulatory punitive approach. And I think that would help us to capture for local authorities data for their regulated and permitted processes, which the data flow isn't great at the moment, and also for the larger industrial processes that report to PIDEC, to the Environment Agency, to SEPA, etc. And so engaging industry in a better form of reporting would be really useful. And then engaging industry as a driving force. I think we're a market-based economy, so we have to make sure that we promote good practice, good environmental practice. And we see quite a lot of that going on now. If you choose brands that you buy from, some which manufacture in the UK, some which don't, they've got sustainability statements, making sure that those are credible, that those are transparent, that they're actually worth the paper they're written on. I think that's really important. And industry does seem to be engaging in that much more, whether that's because their shareholders want it or because their customers want it. They seem to be engaging. I think we could do more to help and encourage that, as a sort of a push from industry and businesses.
Great, thank you. And who do you see as providing the overall leadership for greenhouse gas and air pollution in the UK? And do you think it is really providing the right direction?
Yeah, I think we need government-based leadership on tracking what's going on. So I think BEIS and DEFRA working together on this, they've done quite a good job. And they actually, behind the scenes, they've consistently sponsored from a very early time in the 80s an integrated inventory approach. Now that inventory, which continues to be delivered very, very well by a consultant consortium led by Ricardo, provides an extremely good resource. It's been hamstrung by some of the resource availability and the fact that it was focused very much on a reporting system. Now it's evolving more into a decision-making tool. And I think that as a flow of information into all sorts of different activities led by BEIS and led by DEFRA is a really important aspect. So I think in terms of transparency and tracking, it should be those government departments. We've got the CCC, and then we've got a few other sort of groups and organizations around air pollution. If they could come together as a sort of external independent authority on whether we've got good enough data and what that data is telling us, that will be a really nice thing to see.
Amazing, thank you. And I think we've got time for just one more question, which is, what are the key challenges in translating national and international processes to the city level? And then they say scope 3 emissions as a question.
Yeah. So boundaries are a nightmare, because you start having arguments about who's responsible for what. So I think we need to be quite deliberate and careful how we deal with these boundary issues. And we've got this scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 definition, which I think is really important. And I think we should use those very clearly at a city level, because we don't have a national boundary to define the edges of whether waste disposal from London is accounted for or not, because the waste is taken out of London and dealt with. So we just need extra transparency on that. We need extra consistency between how these things are being dealt with, so that we can have a common set of data to compare different cities. But it's still possible, and it's still possible to do scope 3 analysis, although I would say that you can disappear into quite a big chasm trying to do it properly. So it might be that you need to do that more on a sort of cascading questionnaire basis to understand who of your suppliers are doing what, but not trying to get the exact numbers. But there's a lot to be covered on scope 1 and scope 2 for cities, and I think that we've got enough to do to deal with those, while at the same time trying to understand these wider impacts of our consumption production.
Great. Well, thank you so much for answering all those questions. Just as a final few comments, one of our attendees has said that they're interested in being a stakeholder of the guidance document. So when that's open, if you could let us know, and we can kind of promote that among our membership, and also a link to the report when that's available as well would be amazing.
Okay, that's fine. And I'll share this set of mentee slides as well. And I'll also make the voting so that you can share that and people can go through it. after
That'd
this.
be amazing. Yeah,
Okay.
thank you so much. And thank you so much for the great presentation, and to everyone who attended today. I hope you have a great rest of your day. I hope that you found it beneficial and informative, and please do record your attendance at this webinar on the IES CPD tool. Just to let you know that the next IES webinar is on the 16th of February, and this is on environmental net gain from remediation sites. And as always, you can register for this on the IES website. Thanks very much to you again, Justin, and have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you.
No problem. Thanks a lot, everybody. Take care. Bye.